Welcome to QX Church. I'm Pastor Scott Conway, and we are talking about Christian liberty. This is lesson number 5 in the series, and today we're talking about culture. In lesson 4, we went over a lot of Bible verses, and in the next lesson, we're going to go through some more. Today we're talking about culture. A practical principle of all theology is that culture is context. There are 3 truths, and we're going to unpack each of these 3 truths just a little bit. One is that those who accept Christ come from a culture. So when someone accepts Jesus Christ as their Savior, regardless of where and when in history they are, where and when in the world they are, there is a cultural context from which they come. 2, those who grow up Christian grow up in a culture. So if someone grows up in a Christian household, if someone grows up in church, there is still a culture that surrounds them. And 3, all Christians live in a culture. Put these together and culture is context. That we have a culture that we come from. We have a culture that we grow up in. And we have a culture that we live in. And one of the questions that we have as Christians, as churches, as missionaries, as ministers, as pastors, as leaders, is to what extent must we have conflict with the culture? To what extent can we just have contrast with the culture? And to what extent can we have cooperation with the culture? And so whenever you're dealing with culture, you have to take a look at what about the culture do we have to do anything about? And even when we're looking at conflict with the culture, is it that we need to change the culture? Or is it that we just need to behave differently than the culture? So there's a lot of issues surrounding this cultural element. When there is a Christianity culture conflict, when what we believe is core to Christianity, even if it's just a simple thing of what's core to our congregation, what's core to our denomination, what's core to our theological perspective. When there is a Christianity culture conflict, when the church and culture conflict, the church might get 2 or 3 waking hours a week of church attending, Sunday school, Bible study. Sometimes people just sitting in a pew, waiting for the pastor to finish, perking up just a little bit when the pastor says, and in conclusion. And the culture gets the rest of the time. Whenever you're trying to reach out to people, when you're trying to make a difference in their lives, and you understand, okay, these are people who are seeing popular movies. These are people who are listening to popular music. These are people who are watching television. These are people who are going to work. These are people who are hanging out with friends. These are people who are going to the beach. These are people who are going to the ball. These are people who are getting junk mail. These are people who are online. These are people who are watching the news. And to realize in Christian ministry very often you might have a sliver of their attention. You might get a little bit of their time on a Sunday, and that's not even a guarantee you have their attention. That when you're dealing with human beings in general, you can never assume that just because you believe you're speaking on behalf of God, that they believe that you're speaking on behalf of God. That you can never assume that because you believe you're sharing divine truth, that they just take your word for it and they say, yes, I will live my life that way. That they still have the culture that they live in. They still have the culture as context. Now in a really cool little book called Priests and Kings, this was a book written by a former pastor after he had left the ministry and now he was working in the corporate world. That he had started off in ministry, he had started off in full-time ministry, he had gone to seminary, he grew up in a Christian household, he grew up in what we call the Christian bubble. And what we mean by the Christian bubble is when you're surrounded by Christians, that you interact mostly with other Christians, that the people you spend your time with are mostly church people, that when you interact with businesses, you're mostly dealing with Christian businesses, and you're kind of insulated from the day-to-day realities of just the secular world that you might otherwise be in. And when you grow up in the Christian bubble, when you have this insulation between you and the secular world, it's really easy to say things and to do things and to maintain certain standards and maintain a certain amount of purity, a certain amount of separation from the world, because you have this insulation. Because you can wake up in the morning and you can go through your entire day and you can go to bed at night reasonably certain that at no point during the day will any part of the secular world impose itself in a meaningful way on your life. But then what happened to this young minister is, after he was no longer in ministry, and an unfortunate truth about ministry is that 4 out of 5 churches fail. 4 out of 5 churches never reach a point of being self-sustaining. 4 to 5 churches will eventually close their doors because there's never enough tithes, there's never enough offerings to keep the church alive. And some of the churches might be sustained by a bivocational pastor that has commonly a part-time, even a full-time job aside from being a pastor. Sometimes some of these churches will survive because a denomination continues to support a church for some longer period of time, even though the church isn't self-sustaining. But for the most part, 4 out of 5 churches will eventually close their doors because they simply can't afford to stay open. And so what happened to this pastor is he was one of those pastors. There was never adequate tithes and offerings to continue to support the church closed, and there wasn't another position within his denomination for him to go to. And eventually he ended up getting a regular secular job and beginning a regular secular career. He went from being behind the pulpit to sitting in the pews. And one of the things he began to notice when he was out there in the world, when he's in the corporate environment, when he has a job now, when he's beginning to climb up the ladder of his new career, is that a lot of the things he preached from this side of the pulpit didn't seem to really work on that side of the pulpit. The things that were so easy to tell Christians they ought to do when he was the pastor seemed so hard to live out when he's in the pews. What he found is that a lot of values, a lot of standards, basically a lot of things are easy to say. They're easy to teach. They're easy to tell. They're harder to do. Because culture is context. In this case, the corporate culture is context. There's a lot of stands. It's easy to stand behind the pulpit and say, well, you should make this stand. You need to stand up for Christ. You need to do what's right in the eyes of God. And to realize how difficult some of these things were to do. As simple as it was as a pastor saying, well, you need to spend an hour a day in your quiet time with God. That during some heavy deadline periods of time, which could be weeks, he found it very difficult to find an hour in a day. The expectation of the contribution to the church in both time and money, he found difficult to maintain when he was on the pew side. What he basically found out is that Christian life in an insulated Christian environment made a lot of things easy to do and easy to tell other people to do that was a lot harder to do out in the secular world. That when he got in the context of the culture, when he got in the context of the corporation, when he had to go live in that culture, when he had to work in that culture, when he had to build a career in that culture, he suddenly found it very challenging. And what was easy to say from one side was very difficult to do from the other side. Because he's no longer living in the Christian bubble. He's no longer insulated from the world. He's in the thick of it. He's no longer dealing with a lifestyle where he can openly talk about Christ without any negative ramifications. And now he's in a different culture where he needs to build relation and connection and determine if it's safe, and where if he starts talking about Christ at work, he could lose his career. And as easy as it is, standing behind the pulpit to say, well, you just need to take your stand for Christ. God will take care of you. That the real world experience living in the corporate culture, realizing you are sacrificing your career sometimes if you do things like this, which means you're sacrificing your family's home, which means you're sacrificing your family's car, which means you're sacrificing your kids' school. It means you're sacrificing food on the table. To take a stand in a way that as a Christian in the corporate environment, in the culture, he felt really wasn't necessary. Now, he felt a bit of guilt for having preached all of this from behind the pulpit. And he had to reflect on to what extent, if any, part of the problem of his church never really making it was ultimately how unrealistic he was being. Because what he was teaching from behind the pulpit was basically ignore the context of culture. Ignore the fact that people who accept Christ come from a culture. And just expect that they're just going to plug into the Christian bubble and be able to do things the way we do it in the Christian bubble and be able to live a life in the secular world that looks just like the life you can live if you're insulated from the secular world. That those who grow up Christian but aren't lucky enough, if you want to call it lucky, to be able to live in an insulated Christian world and have to live a life that plugs into the secular world, to be able to expect them to be able to live the same life you live when you're insulated from the secular world. To be able to expect Christians who live in a culture to be able to live as though they live in the Christian bubble. Because the Christian bubble allows you to do things and say things and live a lifestyle and be away from temptation, be away from a lot of the normal day-to-day secular things that really is the context of culture, and almost pretend it doesn't exist. Create a sort of us versus them. Well, that's the world. This is us. But most of us don't do that. Most of us live in the culture. Most of us come from the culture. The culture is context. And when there's a conflict and someone lives in the culture and Christianity can often be at odds with one another. Certainly, bubble-style living, when you can be insulated from all of that, is very, very different. And this is true with anything. Very often, we talk about the Christian bubble. More specifically, we're talking about a denominational bubble, where the people you see on a day-to-day basis, the people you interact with on a day-to-day basis, are people whose theology is very similar to yours. Or you might have a subcultural bubble, where you hang out only with people who from your same subcultural group. People who have the same perspectives, people who have the same style, people who have the same vocabulary. Might hang out with in a political bubble, where you hang out with people with the same political viewpoint you do. That you might never have your politics meaningfully challenged, because your interaction is in this political bubble of your political party or your political persuasion or your party support or your candidate support. And you live in a bubble where you're insulated from meaningful opposition to your particular point of view. And it's really easy. We say, well, we're obviously right. They're obviously being stupid, carnal, worldly, heartless. Whatever it is, whenever you live in any kind of bubble where you are insulated from the outside. That there's an inside and there's an outside, and there's a layer of insulation between you and there. So we're not just talking about this happening to Christians, to anyone of any religion. This is any subcultural group. Whether you're talking about denominational Christianity, whether you're talking about Christianity as a whole, whether you're talking about politics, whether you're talking about a subcultural group, heck, whether you're even talking about fans of a particular musical or entertainment genre, where you can connect only with people who already so agree with you that you're insulated from people who will meaningfully challenge your view. And by the way, when that happens, it's very easy to be judgmental of those outside your insular group. Because those who are in the same bubble with you, it's a sort of an us, which makes it really easy to be judgmental of the them, and therefore cultivate and practice being judgmental and condemning and unforgiving, because you don't have to deal with the outside as real people living real lives with legitimate perspectives. So when we're talking about sex in particular, and the culture about sex, some numbers will help us understand the modern culture of sex in the West, in the United States in particular. Now, this is a 2014 survey of self-identified Christians from Christian Mingle and J-Day, which I believe is an abbreviation of Jesus Day. And so they're surveying self-identified Christians. Now, what's the difference between a self-identified Christian and a real Christian? Well, maybe nothing. But what self-identified Christian means is that when you ask them, are you a Christian, they'll say yes. Or if you ask them, what's your religion, they'll say Christian. Now, are there people who only show up to church on Easter and Christmas who identify as Christians? Yes. Are there people who only show up on Easter who self-identify as Christians? Yes. Are there people who never go to church and the full extent of their Christianity is that they celebrate Christmas? Yes. So self-identified Christianity does not tell you how committed they are to Christ. That doesn't tell you if they've read their Bible. That doesn't tell you if they go to church. That doesn't tell you if they're sitting in a pew on Sunday, even if they do go to church, if they're paying attention. It doesn't tell you what level of priority they give their faith. All it tells you is that when you ask them their religion, they'll say that they're Christian. If you ask them if they're Christian, they'll say yes. And they might just be Christian in the sense that they're not Jewish and they're not Muslim and they're not atheist, so obviously I must be a Christian. I celebrate Christmas, I go Christmas shopping, I'm a Christian. And it could be all the way up to, yes, I've been to seminary, not because I want to go into full-time ministry, just because I was really serious about studying my Bible. And that I'm into the Word of God every single day. I'm praying to God every single day. I'm at church and volunteering in ministry, and I'm a vibrant part of the Christian community, and that my whole life centers around Christ, would also fall in the category of a self-identified Christian. So everywhere from the super committed, full-time vocational minister to the full-time volunteer minister, all the way to the, well, I celebrate Christmas, don't I, would fall in the category of self-identified Christian. So we keep this in mind when we look at some of these numbers. Here's the opening number, 61%. 61% of Christians say they would have sex before marriage. Now think about a basic fundamental of what gets taught typically in the church. Typically in the church, do you hear teaching that says, oh yeah, go ahead, have sex before you marry, that's fine. You won't normally hear that. Typically in the church, what you're going to hear from the time sex is first mentioned is don't do it until you're married. And yet, 61% of Christians say they would have sex before marriage. Now, that number doesn't surprise me. Because having sex before marriage could include what we call premarital sex. Premarital sex is, you've been dating, you've been courting, you're engaged, that you're aimed at a wedding, but the wedding might be somewhere down the road. And that once you're really committed to one another, once you have the ring and the date, that you kind of give yourself permission to start to cross lines. And also depending on what you mean by have sex. Because is oral sex sex? Is sexual sex? Or you only mean intercourse? Doesn't really tell us. But 61%. That part might not be so surprising. That's not necessarily talking about what we call non-marital sex, where you have no relationship, where you have any reasonable expectation at this stage in the relationship that you're going to get married. But here's an interesting number. This one surprised me. 56%. 56% say it's okay to move in with someone after you've been dating from 6 to 24 months. Okay, that one surprised me. Because the 61% having sex before marriage, like, okay, that there's any number of things this could mean, but moving in together, well, that's a different level of engaging in a sexual relationship. That you're moving in together, you're not married. 56%. 59% say it doesn't matter who the primary breadwinner of the family is. Traditionally, the expectation was that the husband would be the primary breadwinner of the family. Well, now 59% of self-identifying Christians say it doesn't matter. He could make more money, she could make more money. Traditionally, if you back up a couple of generations, if you go back to my grandmother's day, the expectation was that only single women worked. Married women were housewives. And certainly, married mothers were housewives. 34% say it isn't necessary to marry someone with the same faith. Over a third. Now, this is another stat that doesn't really tell us what we mean by this, because do they mean Christian, Muslim, like lack of same faith, or do they mean, Baptist, Lutheran? So 61% of Christians say they would have sex before marriage. 56% say it's okay to live together without being married. 59% say it doesn't matter who the primary breadwinner is, which of course isn't a sex standard, but it does tell you about how traditional viewpoints have shifted over a couple of generations. And 34% say it isn't necessary to marry someone of the same faith. Now here's some more statistics. These from the National Campaign to Prevent Teen and Unplanned Pregnancies report. 80% of self-identifying evangelical singles, so this is a particular branch of Christianity, the evangelicals, what you might call mainline Protestant Christianity. 80% of self-identifying evangelical singles say they've had sex. 80%, 4 out of 5. 64% of them report having had sex within the past year. So this isn't just, oh yeah, I did that one time, things got out of control. 64% report having had sex within the past year. Now this is of singles. Self-identifying evangelical singles. Now on the heartening part, that also means that 16% of the 80% that have had sex haven't had sex in the last year. Doesn't say why, but it is an indication. 42% are in a current sexual relationship. So of self-identifying evangelical singles, 42% are in a current sexual relationship. A non-marriage relationship. Now they may think they're getting married. They may be engaged. They may be promised. They may be courting. We don't know. What we do know is they're not married. And they're currently in a relationship that involves sexual activity. Now here's a huge one. And we're going to get back to this particular number later. 30%. 30% of evangelical single women have reported at least one pregnancy. 65%. 2/3, 65% of women seeking abortions identify as Protestant or Catholic. Now this is self-identification, so back to all of the same admonitions before. It can include everyone up to full-time ministers and full-time volunteers and full-time ministers, up to, well, I celebrate Christmas, I don't celebrate something else. But 65% of women seeking abortions identify as Protestant or Catholic. Considering most of these are in direct conflict with the teaching that those on this site and those in the survey have probably learned in church, that have probably learned in their Christian homes, that have probably learned in Sunday school, whenever the subject has been brought up, it's amazing that these answers would show up in a survey. One of the challenges very often you have when you're doing any kind of social science isn't just what's true, it's what people are willing to admit to. That a lot of times there's information that's hard to come by because people won't tell you the truth. This is why you can get bizarre surveys where you find out that the average man has had sex with 7 women, while the average woman has had sex with 4. You're okay. If you assume about a 50-50 split, you have 100 men and 100 women, and the average man's been with 7 women, and the average woman's been with 4 men, on a roughly even 50-50 split. Who are the other 3 that the men are having sex with if the women aren't having sex with the men? So these kind of problems happen in social science because women, by and large, and some of this might be driven by culture, don't want to admit to a higher number. And in interviews with women, what they found is that some women just don't count certain things. Like, well, he didn't count. Well, why not? Because he just didn't. That was a mistake, so he doesn't count. And some men will add numbers. Okay, well, it was close enough. So there still seems to be something, and this has probably been true for centuries, for millennia possibly, where men who can attract women and create this kind of desire in women that they'll do that with them, gain status as being run women. But for women, a lot of their status still seems to be connected to purity. And of course, as we mentioned before, we're not 100% sure what the statistics might mean because we don't know what the person responding to the statistic means by the statistic. Like the same-faith statistic. And what do they mean by sex before marriage? Are you talking about sex with someone you're engaged to because you're planning this big wedding and it's not for a year off? Or do you mean a random hookup on a Friday night with someone that you met 3 hours beforehand? I mean, there's a whole range of possibilities there, and the stat doesn't tell us. So sometimes statistics don't tell us what we actually need to know. Now, a note in here is your sexual status is not your identity. Now, this goes in both directions, whether you're a man and you think you have to have conquest, or you're a woman and you think you have to do the purity thing. So in this important interlude, to remember your sexual status is not your identity. You are more than your sexual status. Some people are taught that their sexual status, their sexual behavior, and here's one that is incredibly annoying, or what was done to them, is primary to their identity. We disagree. Women in particular are often judged on such a basis. We think that's ridiculous. Even if we were to agree that sex outside of marriage is sin. Let's just assume we agree with that. I know we haven't gotten all the way there yet, but let's just make that assumption. What would make it so dramatically different from any other sin that we would use it as a primary identity? Now, this is how bad it gets. I was watching a couple of older Christian women talking to a young, maybe a teenager, early 20s, a college-age girl, so 18 to 22 probably. And she was wearing those low hip-hugger jeans, and a couple of inches of her belly, waist, I'm not quite sure how you define that particular segment of the body, was showing whenever she would reach up to grab something. And some of the older Christian women said, well, you have to watch out what you're wearing because, some man's going to look at that and they're going to think that you're sexually available, and if they think you've had sex, you'll never get a good man. Their idea being that any good man would never pursue a relationship with any girl who even looked like she might possibly have had sex. Much less a woman who's actually ever had sex, ever having any hope of getting a decent Christian man. Because the way these women were talking, that was primary to her identity. Another mother told me that she had spent a lot of time in these various parenting groups and purity groups, and the whole idea was to raise your daughters to not have sex until you're married. And what she began to realize, as she was one of my coaching clients, was that the entirety of the training, the ministry she grew up in, admonished the parents to give to their daughters in preparation for marriage was just don't have sex. And that if you just don't have sex until you're married, it means you're a good wife. If you just don't have sex until you're married, it means you're a good Christian girl. And that was the only thing that ever came up in any of the discussions of preparing your daughters for marriage. Now, on the male side, talking to the dad, similar ministries, the only thing that ever came up on the male side was money. You have to make money. You have to have an income. You have to be able to provide so that your wife can live at home and not have to work. Because if you're a good Christian man, to be a good Christian man, you have to be able to support a family. And you have to be able to support a family at a level where your wife can stay home so that when she has children, she can stay home and she can raise the children. And to not pressure women into sex. Don't put her in the position where she's going to have to say no. And that was pretty much it. Men make money, women don't have sex. And then your wedding day and the marriage afterwards will be perfect. Well, they wouldn't quite say perfect, but that it'll be good. And you didn't need to know anything else. And they began to realize, life is a little more dimensional than just women don't have sex and men need to make money. So there are still some places that put a primary identity on sex. And where it gets particularly egregious to me is I have seen places where a woman who has been raped or someone who is molested as a child, someone who's been the victim of somebody else, is treated like damaged goods because of what somebody else did to them. And that somehow the victim is dirty. Somehow it means something about the victim instead of just meaning something about the perpetrator. Now, when you're dealing with culture, culture changes. The Bible is the same. We went through a whole bunch of verses in the Bible. And all of those verses are still the same as they were when they were written. The Bible says what the Bible says, and the words in the Bible don't keep changing. But culture changes. So the question is, does Christian liberty allow sexual freedom? That is this a cultural thing? That if you travel the world, you wind your way down through history, is this something that you have to address in Christian ministry? Does the cultural shift mean that sexual freedom is now allowed? We've seen that there is a cultural shift. Or do the old cultural rules still control? Because the Bible hasn't changed. The words in the Bible are still the words in the Bible. The books of the Bible are still the books of the Bible. The words still say what the words have always said. And the words still mean something. The Bible did not change, and the Bible is not silent. Now, we do have some practical questions. And practical questions are separate from moral questions. So let's take a look at some of these practical questions. Even without arguing the moral question, without talking about morality at all, without telling a single sexually active person, well, what you're doing is just wrong and you ought not be doing it, without going to a single Christian single and say, well, you can't be having sex, that's against God. Let's just talk about practical stuff. Let's just set the moral issue aside. So they go, all right, maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong. Maybe it's okay, maybe it isn't. Let's not even talk about that, but let's just look at the practical side. Practical questions are separate from moral questions. Even without arguing the moral question, we can take a look at practical questions. Sometimes the practical questions help shed light on the moral question. Even when they don't, practical questions are still relevant because they're practical. Before we get into any kind of debate over morality, let's look at practical issues. Sometimes the rationale behind some moral issues becomes more clear when you look at practical issues. And without even getting in an argument with someone, some young Christian single about what is and isn't okay, well, let's just look at the practical questions first. What about sexually transmitted diseases? Condoms are the most common defenses against sexually transmitted diseases, but no, they do not make you 100% safe. Now, stats are hard to find. I found this kind of surprising. Everywhere I went looking for information, I kept, well, you need to use a condom, and condoms make it safer, and condom is the best defense. And, okay, but I want numbers. That if you were engaged in a sexual relationship with someone who has a disease, how well do condoms do? Now, there's HPV, and apparently the majority of people who engage in any kind of sexual relationship at some point in their lives are going to pick up HPV. And that it is transmitted through sex. It also seems that it's so prevalent out there. It seems to me that you don't even have to have sex to get HPV, but sex is a primary way that it is transmitted. It's like half, more than half. Okay, so let's set that aside because that's not generally something we think of as an STI. But when I try to find numbers, the only number I could come up with about the effectiveness rate of condoms is they were 80% effective at preventing disease. The implication there being that if you're having sex with someone who has a sexual disease, a sexual infection, a sexual something that is transmissible during sex, and you are using a condom, if you otherwise would have picked up the infection, the condom has a 4 in 5 chance of protecting you. That means 20% not effective. That means you still have a 1 in 5 chance of picking up the infection, even though you're using a condom. And many conditions can last years, even decades, without producing symptoms. And so in some cases, there's just no telling. And someone may get some of these symptoms and had nothing to do with whether they've actually had intercourse with someone, but just that they've been exposed by any number of ways. So that's one question. What about sexually transmitted diseases? And because some diseases may lay dormant for years or even decades, that unless you've been tested with a test that is capable of detecting that particular infection, at whatever stage or level of infection you have, you may never know. You may not find out for years. You may not find out for decades. So that's one. But here's a big one. I'm not personally as worried about sexually transmitted infections because if you have a repercussion from your own choices, you can decide if you want to take that chance. But here's one that involves an innocent life. The question, what's the plan for pregnancy? 30% of evangelical single women report at least one pregnancy. 65% of women seeking abortions identify as Catholic or Protestant. Clearly, pregnancies happen. Of 100 sexually active couples using birth control, here are the annual pregnancy numbers. Of couples using injectable birth control, which means there's an injection and the injection is good for some stretch of time. If that's the primary means of birth control, out of 100 couples, you will have 6 pregnancies. Of using the pill, of 100 sexually active couples using the pill, 9 pregnancies. Now, especially when it comes to things like the pill, if you look at the stats on the pill, the effectiveness ranges anywhere from 87% for the weakest pill up to like 99 point something for the most effective pill. You go, well, how is this 9 in 100 possible? Well, part of it is, in one study they did some time ago, that they were actually concerned about this number. I mean, 9 in 100 getting pregnant on the pill. And what they found is about a third of women, young women in particular, who thought they were using the pill correctly, were not using the pill correctly. Now, this is part of what makes it difficult, is the women thought they were okay. They thought they were doing it right. One of the things is you have about a 15-minute window. You need to take the pill at about the same time every day. Okay, that's one. But another one is how many things will shut off the pill. Antibiotics in particular. And so if you take antibiotics, then your pill is much less effective. Some people have gone so far as to say it practically shuts the pill off. So 9 in 100. 9 in 100 sexually active women on the pill get pregnant in any given year. Diaphragms, 12 in 100. Male condoms. So if a condom is the primary means of birth control, 18 pregnancies out of every 100 sexually active couples. 18. That's pretty close to 1 in 5. Withdrawal, 22 in 100. Fertility awareness, 24 in 100. So the pill and the condom are two of the most common forms of birth control, at least that I hear people talking about. 9 in 100 on the pill, 18 in 100 with the condom. Now, I'm sure that those stats are based in part upon improper use. And probably improper use from some combination where they know that they didn't put on the condom soon enough, or they know that they should take the pill more regularly and they don't always. But also the people who might think they're doing it right. And they don't know they're doing it wrong because they're kind of a little embarrassed to get the necessary education. Or they don't know that some other medication that they're taking or some other activity in which they are engaging is making it less effective. 9 in 100. 18 in 100. So here's a question, without even getting into the moral issues surrounding abortion. This is a question for singles and marrieds. What does a child deserve? The question, what does a child deserve? What does a baby deserve? If you were to choose for your child, what situation would you choose for your child? A loving, married mother and father, ready to be parents? Or would you prefer that your child have one parent? Or would you prefer your child be given up for adoption? Or would you prefer your child were aborted? So if you were going to decide, I want a pregnancy, what would you want for that child? Now you might go, well, it's not really a child until it's born. Okay, well, let's go with that. Let's just go with the pregnancy. So you say, well, what I really want to do is I really want a pregnancy to have an abortion because, I think the abortion is a good thing. I've never heard anyone say anything like that. I've never heard anyone say, well, I really want to have a pregnancy so that we can have a child put up for adoption. That's what I really want. Now, I have from time to time heard someone say, well, I really want a pregnancy because I want a baby of my own, from single women who want to have a baby but don't necessarily want to have a man. I have heard that one from time to time. But if you were to ask even those women, well, if you have a choice between having a loving marriage and having a man in your life to be father to the child, so you have a two-parent household of loving parents who know how to get along with one another and they understand love and they have a great relationship and they're a good parenting team to raise the child together, or would you prefer to do it as a single? Well, I said, well, of course I would prefer the great partner. A lot of times when you get into this, it's that they don't think there's such a thing as a great partner is ultimately the issue. So when you start to look at these preferences, if you were to choose what you believe a child of yours deserves, what choice would you make? What would you want for your child? And is this the parent you would choose for your child? So if you're a man and you're having sex with a woman, is this the mother you would pick for your child? If you're a woman having sex with a man, is this the man you would pick for your child's father? Is this the mother? Is this the father? Is this the person you would want your child to be like? Is this the person you would want raising your kid, raising your son, raising your daughter, showing them what marriage is about, showing them what relationship is about, showing them what masculinity is about, what femininity is about, showing them what it's like to live life? And what if they turned into this person? What if they turned into the logical consequence of someone being raised by this person? Is that what you choose? Another question. Are you emotionally ready? Now, almost everyone who has sex answers yes to this question. If you ask anyone who's having sex, like, are you sure you're emotionally ready to be having sex? Almost everyone I've ever talked to and asked a question like this has always said yes. I said, okay, well, also consider, because this is part of being emotionally ready to have sex. Are you emotionally ready for a lover to be an ex? Very often when a relationship ends and it ends badly and it's messy and it's nasty, it's because sex was involved. Sex changes things. So are you emotionally ready to be a lover and then be an ex? To not just be an ex-boyfriend, an ex-girlfriend, but to be ex-lovers. And potentially still see this person. I mean, depending on the nature of your relationship, when you say, well, we can still be friends. Well, maybe you will actually still be friends. Maybe you'll still see each other. Maybe you'll still see each other at work if it's a coworker. Maybe you'll still see each other at whatever activity you have in common if you both continue in that activity. Maybe you'll still see each other at church if both of you are involved in the same church. So are you emotionally ready to have sex and break up and still see that person? Are you emotionally ready for a lover to move on to a new lover? To know that now there was someone else in the way that they used to be with you. That now they're being with someone else in the way they used to be with you. And maybe even to see them together with that other person. Because maybe this person who dated a coworker when you were the coworker will date another coworker, and you will see them together as a couple. Maybe you'll still see them together at social functions. Maybe you'll see them together at church functions, since we are talking specifically about Christians having sex. For most people, sex changes things. Are you emotionally ready for a pregnancy? Are you emotionally ready, if you're a man, for her to come tell you she's pregnant? Are you emotionally ready as a woman to be late on your period and to wonder? Are you emotionally ready to take that pregnancy test and find out that you are pregnant? Are you emotionally ready for the chosen plan for pregnancy? And are you also ready for that plan to change? Because what if the plan for pregnancy, say, was an abortion? But then when she's pregnant, she feels like, I can't go through with it. I have to keep my baby. So if you're the man, you don't get a say. You don't get to declare, well, no, you have to have an abortion. And if the plan for pregnancy was, well, of course, we'll stay together and we'll be partners, and whether she has decided somewhere along the way, it's like, no, I don't want this man to be the father of my baby. I'd rather have an abortion. You don't get a say in that direction either. So are you emotionally ready for the chosen plan for pregnancy? Are you emotionally ready for the long-term consequences of that plan? And are you ready for that plan to change? To be changed on you? Another question. Are you ready for future consequences? Are you ready for future consequences? Men may have children they don't know about. As a man, if you have sex with a woman and you don't constantly see her, maybe you're around her for a month or 2 or even 3, but you don't see her for 6 months, 9 months, 12 months. She could get pregnant with your child and you may not know. And she may not tell you. 18 years later, you could have some adult show up and knock on your door and say, hey, Dad. Women may get pregnant and not be sure who the father is. Now, I know some people refer to, the slut. It's like, well, it's the same thing as men having sex. The difference being, if she's pregnant, she may not be 100% sure if she's had sex with more than one man in the month. Just like a man who's had sex with more than one woman in a month might have no idea if he's going to be the father of a baby or two or three. I sat with one woman one time, and her particular struggle is she found out she was pregnant. The problem she had is the father could have been any of three men. Now, we narrowed it down to probably one of the two, and all three of the men were of a different racial heritage. What that meant was when the child was born, it was going to be obvious who the father was. So are you ready for those kind of consequences? Women may get pregnant, not be sure who the father is. Now, she took her best guess. It turned out the other man was the father. The impact of some choices can show up much later, decades later, as now adult children come looking for their missing parent, their birth parents. And another question, this is another practical question. Do you want something left to share? Do you want something left to share? In any given relationship, if you think about marriage, is there anything you want to have left to share with your partner to upgrade your physical relationship when you get married? Now, obviously, traditionally, by conventional morality has been handed down through thousands of years of tradition, that was sex. That when you got married, you got to have sex. Well, if you weren't married, you didn't get to have sex. And then that was the upgrade. Now, if you're not going to wait for that, do you want something else left to share? Is there going to be anything in your physical relationship as husband and wife that wasn't already part of the relationship? That if you have your wedding night together, is there anything from that wedding night, is there anything for the honeymoon that hasn't all gone before? Do you want to have something left to share? Do you want to have something for your wedding night? Do you want to have something for your honeymoon that wasn't part of your relationship before? That's up to you. As a general question, is there anything you want to save for marriage? And as a broader question, if you're engaging in various physical, sexual, sensual activities with your partners along the way, partners that maybe you don't get married to, is there anything you want to have left to share for the person you will eventually marry? As well as, do you want to have something left to share for once you are married? Is that physical relationship going to be an upgrade or a downgrade? And to be honest, too often I see it as a downgrade. And it shouldn't be happening that way. Your marital relationship, your physical relationship as husband and wife should be an upgrade from your physical relationship before you were married. So, back to the moral question. Does Christian liberty allow sexual freedom? On a moral level, that's a legitimate question. On a practical level, without even getting to the moral questions, like, okay, well, setting aside the moral debate, because imagine if you're trying to argue with someone, and that they're a Christian single and they're having sex. And well, what you're doing is morally wrong. All right, well, let's back up and say, like, okay, well, what are you doing to protect yourself from sexually transmitted diseases? Have you been tested? Have you checked with the testing authorities, whoever you go to for your test, whether it's the county health and human services, so you're having it tested for free, or whether it's your medical doctor, whoever it is doing the test, have you confirmed with them, okay, how long do you have to wait for the tests that are being done to be reasonably effective in making the determination if you have a possible infection? So have you been tested? And what precautions are you taking? Has your partner been tested? If your partner has any prior experience, have they been tested? And if you've already had sex, well, it might have already been transmitted. And it might have been transmitted from something you've had for years. Something that you got a decade ago that you might not know about if you've never been tested. or if whatever it is you might have is something that doesn't normally show up on whatever tests you had done. So what's your STI plan? What's your plan for pregnancy? Have you discussed this with the person you're having sex with? If I have separate discussion with you and your partner, do both of you have the same plan for pregnancy? Are both of you committed to the same plan? Have you thought through what you think a child of yours might deserve? Are you emotionally ready? Have you really considered the emotion involved? Are you ready for those consequences? Do you want something left to share? I mean, maybe not. Maybe it's, no. I want to do all the fun stuff beforehand. Married couples don't have sex. I grew up watching television and the movies. It's young, single, hot people that have sex, not married couples. Well, that's in the media. But I mean, imagine that's like part of your thinking going into marriage. So even without answering the question as to whether Christian liberty allows sexual freedom, you have all these practical considerations. And the practical considerations can make the decision for us, completely apart from the yes, no of a moral debate. Just have a practical discussion. If you want to persuade someone, have the practical discussion. Because then you're just dealing with numbers, statistics, simple realities, things to consider. So even apart from the moral question, traditional morality makes practical sense, even without making it a moral issue. And of course, we're going to get into that question in the next lesson. So in Christian Liberty 6, we're going to actually dive into the moral question. And we're going to talk about the morality surrounding sex, keeping in mind that if you just already had the practical discussion, that you may have already solved the issue. And if you start with the practical, and from the practical, then you talk about how much sense traditional morality makes, you may have already solved your issue. You don't have to fight about the morality because the practicality may have already answered the question for you. And if someone says, we use birth control, so no one's going to get pregnant. So go, well, which birth control do you use? Let's look up some numbers here. Oh, you use condoms. Okay, well, let's pull up our condom numbers. Let's see. Of couples who rely on condoms for birth control, you have 18 pregnancies out of every 100 sexually active couples. Now what that means is, statistically speaking, in about 5.5 years, you're likely to have a pregnancy. It's about 50-50 because of the way numbers work. Half won't have gotten pregnant yet. Half will have gotten pregnant one or more times. 18 out of 100. That means sooner or later you've got to expect a pregnancy, logically. So, and she's on the pill. Okay, she's on the pill. 9 in 100. So if she's on the pill, 9 couples using the pill as their birth control get pregnant out of every 100 sexually active couples using the pill. What's your plan for pregnancy? Got to have a plan for pregnancy. Now, if you're going to do the pill and the male condom, well, then you're probably down to 2 in 100. Okay, that's still 1 out of 50. Now, to put some of this in perspective, I went to San Diego State University. San Diego State University had 30,000 students when I went there. Now, let's just assume that these 30,000 students are all coupled. So you have 15,000 couples. If you have 15,000 couples, let's assume that 10,000 of those 15,000 couples were coupled enough that they're having sex and that they're consistent lovers, just so that it makes our math easier to do. So if we have 10,000 of the couples, if they were all using the pill, that'd be 900 women pregnant every year. What about the 10,000 couples, they all use the condom? that would be 1,800 women pregnant every year. And when you start to look at those kind of numbers, it's easy to look at statistics. Well, there's a 91% chance I'll be fine. Okay, and there's a 9% chance that you will be one of the ones that aren't. Someone out there is getting pregnant. And it might be you. It might be your partner. Are you ready? And so when you start to really dive into some of these, if someone's sexually active and they've already been through a breakup, how did that go? How did the sex make that different? Were you seriously able to continue to be friends? Were you seriously able to continue to be coworkers? Were you seriously able to still be in the same group? Were you seriously able to still be there when they have another lover and seriously continue to be friends? Are you seriously emotionally ready for all of that? Or is your solution to hide? For a lot of people, the solution is to hide. I just can't be around an ex-lover. I just can't be around an ex-lover when I know they're with their new lover. And that's how most people handle that. But if it was a more friendly dating, a more casual dating, it shouldn't be a problem. So the practical questions can solve the issue for us. But even though the practical may solve the issue for us, we're still going to talk about whether Christian liberty allows sexual freedom in Christian Liberty 6 next time. Thank you.